Hello and most welcome to 993. We will today talk about synthesia or synthesia. And there are two ways of looking at synthesia. One is those exceptions within psychoneurology where people can hear colors or see flavors and so on. Another one is something that is suggested in this article by William C. Bushell and Maureen Seberg, and that is that the synesthesia is more original. This is how we really perceive the world, and this division between the senses that we do in the Western Hemisphere, it's a rather recent approach, and it can actually take away some of the finer details in all the different senses. According to them, there is only one sense. I mentioned in the previous lecture that does indeed make sense. Reason for that being that all the senses originated in only one, and that was called taste, hearing, and vision. And it was exactly the same thing, and it was actually even more united than just the senses. It was also motion. So motion and perception are the same thing, and actually the neural transmitters going to the different sensory organs are not very different from the motor neurons. So the idea of making a difference can be problematic, and I would even suggest it can cause harm to the human system. At least it will obscure reality, because it's not of reality. It's a construction that could hinder realization of different things. And one of those things is actually to understand our world we're living in. And I'm not talking about the idea that the world could be an invention by Socrates / Aristotle, or an invention by Isaac Newton. No, I'm actually speaking of the real reality, the one that is out there even though nobody invented it. And that's the reality of quantum mechanics. That is the observable universe. And in the observable universe, we notice that synesthesia is the thing. There is nothing outside synesthesia. That meaning that the observer-dependent reality is a synesthesic experience. Some people think you can make a division and say, well, it's just vision that is important when you make the superposition collapse, or it is just the senses and not your action, or your thinking is somehow outside the point. So thinking in itself won't lead to a collapse of the superposition. And if that's true or not, I'm not quite sure. But what I can say is the following: and if we don't take all the senses at one singular point, sort of unite them, or why not negate the disuniting, then we can have a pure experience, and that could actually explain the collapse of the wave function. Superposition, I don't think it would be possible to explain otherwise. If we have this division, we can always say, I didn't hear that collapse of the superposition, or I didn't feel it. That wouldn't make sense. And I'm also thinking of different languages where the division is different. And the third thing that can actually help you to your understanding is to understand that the third dimension, we know, and we have been knowing for at least since the Second World War, that small kids learn the third dimension by their tactile senses, not vision, not at all. Take away the tactile senses, if the kid has some sort of neurological disease that makes it impossible for that particular child to have tactile sensation, that person will not develop a depth understanding. And it will neither understand what an object is. To understand those things, it's synesthesia that counts. And I also mentioned earlier the idea that we are like a flat surface. I think that comes from the preemptive random division that we do and say something is vision and something is hearing, because hearing doesn't make a disjunction between front and back in the same way. They are both one perceptual gestalt. It's a holistic approach, and if you divide that holistic approach in your own emotional subjective sense according to your own bias, or you do that by fiat, I decide I want to make a personal division that has nothing to do with reality, doesn't follow the laws of neurology, neither the laws of quantum physics, then you can start assuming that there is a difference between vision and hearing. But in reality there is none. And one of the things that you will perceive if you expand your senses and let them sort of slide into each other is that you get a much keener awareness of your presence. You get more self-aware. And one of those things that is very common today is that we don't have any good sense of our balance. We slouch and we do not really catch the ground. It used to be said that has only to do with the body, but we know that not to be true, because the most damage is actually made to our intellectual capacity. If we're not grounded on the ground, all of the abstract thinking disappears, and it disappears almost immediately. And since intellectual projection is not that common today, maybe it's not that much of a hindrance. But if you are really interested in understanding, for instance, quantum mechanics or the working of your own body because you want to gain a better health or get a better balance, you need to understand the workings of the unitary sense, the synesthesia. That is very important. Now to some facts here to spice the whole thing up. There have been going on many interesting experiments the last couple of years, or it's only one of the experiments is only 1.5 years old. It has shown that our auditory time interval, timing and hearing, is very closely connected. Something that we learned from Susie Frobel, if you remember. But now it turns out in experiments that have been proven several times that there are some people, not all, but some people that can do auditory time intervals in the range of a millionth of a second. And there is also people who can make a tactile discrimination down to the level of individual molecules. And there is indication, very good indication as such also, that there are some persons who are just like the robin that we mentioned maybe 2 years ago, the robin coming from Jim Al-Khalili, I think his name was. And what could that robin do? It could actually perceive of singular photons. But now, listen to this, lo and behold, there are evidence that there are some human beings who can actually discriminate between individual photons, just like the robin. So we get more and more indications that our living system is actually adapted to the quantum mechanical world, and that there are, so to speak, outer realities dependent on what sort of categories we do, how we use our language, or what sort of predisposition do we put into reality? We talked earlier about the level of your complexity is what sort of grade your experience. So there is a level of experience, and there are lower experience and there are higher experience. Higher experience are always more true, they are more correct, they are more predictive. So you see here, we have the potentiality to be more in the real world. And obviously, and I made that conclusion already when I heard about this thing, quantum biology, and that is, if quantum mechanics is the true working of the world, why would not Mother Nature use quantum mechanics? Why would Mother Nature do some sort of arbitrary division between the real world and the world that Isaac Newton constructed? I don't think that makes any sense at all. We are all pretty sure that Newton was a great inventor and a genius of high rank, but he didn't construct the universe. There is no chance of that. Let's get into quantum entanglement. When it comes to the instance of quantum entanglement, something that is very hard to explain, it gets much more simple once we understand that our senses are not divided. The very division that we make in between the senses are usually the cause of this confusion. I got this idea from Lacan, and this is what he calls object persistence, something he invented himself, and he said this is something a child learns when it grows up. And when it comes to things that are out of reach for the young developing toddler, in the beginning the toddler assumes those things to be out in the fog, not something that he or she, or rather it, interacts with. But then it comes to a certain point and you can see the toddler sort of opens its eyes and the whole body gets more directed. It seems to become more present in the world, and all of a sudden it starts to direct its attention towards the outer world and to other people like mom and dad and brothers and sisters. In this process, at least in the beginning, there is no what Lacan calls object permanence. So if you turn up in the visual field and then a second later you disappear from the visual field, that won't affect the kid. But at a certain stage the kid would be wondering, where did you go? And this is the start, especially in Western culture, of something is called object permanence. So that will often lead to the kid start looking for the parent who disappeared. And a little later, just a couple of months later, this tick-a-boo game starts, when you hide yourself like this and all of a sudden you spring into action or reality or existence. And in this process we assume the kid to understand how reality really works, that there are true existing things out there. But that conclusion can actually be twisted in a quantum mechanical way, and maybe it's not a true conclusion. Maybe existence is something we sort of predicate to things that we already experienced, and the experience comes first. One good reason to think that is that the child already, long before it has objects or existences, can perceive things. Already in the belly, the child is actually hearing. That is the first sense, except for taste, which come into reality. And we know already that newborns respond much better to the language of the parents than other languages. So for instance, a child do hear the mother's tongue already before it's born, and it has already become acquainted, conditioned to the mother tongue, and understands that better. And that of course gets very interesting. Then we have conditioning already before birth. And in a sense it makes a lot of sense, because of course the belly, the bowel, the womb of the mother is permeable to language, to sounds. And all of a sudden we start to understand also that a kid is never born as a tabula rasa. It already has a lot of characteristics of the world. And I would say to that we have to add, it is very far from being a blank board. It is always already inscribed. Reality never left the baby was already a part of reality. So forth, it's inscribed. Going further in the development, we jump a couple of years. Some languages never get this object persistence or permanence. For instance, the Hopi language. You can still play tickaboo with the Hopi kids, but apparently they never developed this fixation in existence. So you see, already in the game, in the interaction with the parents, it's established a sort of an ontic mood, and that doesn't have to come into existence. And I think that bare fact that it doesn't have to come in existence is very interesting. That shows that there are actually developmental proof also of that the ontic take of Heidegger and Derrida, it's not a necessary take. It could even be something that obstructs thinking. When we jump a couple of years and go into the school years, or maybe just before, when the child learns to read, it will in the beginning use a sounding device that seems to be inborn. So when it hears a sound, it tries to imitate it, just like a parrot. And that imitating game seems to be going on with all the senses. It is most obvious with hearing and speaking, but that is also taking place with seeing, the tactile senses, smelling and tasting. So there is a mirroring with the surrounding environment, in particular living people, where the kid learns what the world consists of by mirroring the experience of the parent or the sensory output of the parent, because the kid is actually sensitive to what sort of output you give. We mentioned earlier that the ear actually gives off a small signal from the cochlear. The signals coming out from the eyes, from the tactile senses, from the olfactory sense, and from the gustatory sense are also perceptible by the kid. And all those will be a sort of conditioning on the kid. And that will happen already before language is put in place. I would say already in the belly. And that is most interesting, because that changes a lot about things about reality. We cannot trust our perceptions in the same way. Some of those things are molded into our deepest roots, and my clue is these things can only be questioned by our intellect, and we cannot go to our senses, because see, they are established long before birth. That makes it very hard. It makes it very hard to question them in another way than purely intellectual. Now you understand that there are troubles with these things going on. But this mimicking is also how we learn written language. In the beginning, we try to sound off the letters. Once that is established, we can go to the next level and putting the letters to words. And the kid will sound out the words. All kids do that. There is no exception. So they need to sound it out, like table, so they can understand the connection between the written ligature and the sound. And thereby there is another conditioning going on, a conditioning that can also be tricky if you don't understand it once upon a time happened. And that's the connection between a sound and how it's depicted. Once that is done, the sounding becomes more and more silent. It doesn't have to become completely silent. In 5% of the population, there is still a slight movement perceptible in the mouth when the person reads. We usually take that movement as a sign of stupidity, but it's not true. It can also be highly intelligent people that do that movement. But it seems that if we can make it internal, so the hearing goes inwards, and the cochlear will still be active, we're still sending out a signal, but that signal goes inward. And that is so you can understand what you read yourself. And this is something I mentioned in the previous lecture. But the funny and interesting thing is, if you're not able to make complex sounds, and now I'm talking about sounds you cannot hear, you will not understand the text to the same level. Let me give you an example. If the sound that you produce when you're reading, this can be seen actually in a specific measuring instrument going directly to the cochlear. If it's too sinus curved, the understanding of the text will be less. Whereas you have a high complexity understanding, that you are sending out a complex signal. That complex signal equals that you actually hear a human voice when you do the reading. And that human voice has characteristics. It has intonation, it has pitch, it has even vibrato. And you can sense that person when you read the text. The text will give a much greater yield. And I have a memory actually when I read a book when I was quite young. I could hear the voices, and they differed from paragraph to paragraph somehow. And sometimes it was a deep booming voice when the narrator came in, and sometimes there were softer voices when the role takers in, I think it was a tale I read or some sort, tales from the northern Scandinavia. I have just a vague memory, and they all had different voices to them, and it seems that voicing is very, very important. If you read the text with a robotic voice, as it's often called, and that means when you read the text you don't have a sense that there is a human being behind the text, and your cochlear will send out a signal that is much less complex. That will also mean that your understanding of the text will lessen, because there is less complexity coming from the internal cochlear towards the read text. And you also see the combination here by making a division. When I look at the text and say this is one thing, this is one sense, I read the text, I need lighting and so forth, and my internal hearing, it's something completely different. That will in itself cause a disjunct in the curve, because it is two waves, at least two waves. There are usually much more than two waves. One wave coming from the cochlear and one wave coming from the visual organ. But we have more waves, and if you divide them prematurely and say those are two different senses, you will diminish the complexity of the waves, because it is when the waves are helping each other, for instance in the troughs and in the peaks, that you get the most sensitive understanding of the text, which can be incredibly varied. That was really surprised me. The level, the depth of understanding of a text varies enormously. And I think that is one of those things we are simply not aware of. And this of course could be the subject for a whole other lecture, but the lack of understanding that the depth of understanding is different is in itself something very interesting. Why is it so? And if it is so, then that means that we don't train our understanding of texts anymore. Or maybe it never was the case. I think it was the case. I think we inherently earlier always trained our understanding of a text, and that we never gave up that training our whole lives, and that we got more and more skilled at actually listen, understanding, seeing the text, and that as a perpetual development, instead of the idea, which is completely wrong, that once you learn reading there's no more development. That idea in itself could actually be quite damaging to your development potential. And since all texts are not the same level of complexity, that would mean that you can never read some text if you don't train that ability. And I have my own explanation for this so-called robot voice, and that explanation is that we nowadays think everybody reads off a text in the same way, and then we don't care about it. If we don't care about it, it means that we will not put any energy in the outgoing auditory signal and in outgoing visual signal. And since that is three times as more important than the ingoing signal, that will make what you get much less. The difference will become much less, and if you have less difference, you will also have much less sameness, because it starts in that area. First, we begin with difference, we send out signals. It doesn't matter from what sensory organs, because they are in a way a conjointed communal wave. So the many waves that are superimposed on each other. I don't have a whiteboard here, but think about first one wave and then we have another wave, and it is the conjoint force that decides how much you get from each sensory division, if you make the sensory division afterwards, which is better. So they are helping each other, and this is called the synergetic effect, which is very important to remember, that the synergetic effect, and that is how the different senses help each other. And if you make a premature division, the synergetic effect will be much less. And synergia is something we have maybe most easily proven by thinking of food. If you make a dish, for instance a stew, you can put in different ingredients like tomato, carrots, celery, meat and so forth. You could put a bouillon, but then you have the synergetic effect. That is how all the spices co-join to make each other spice stronger. And this is the key to understanding cooking. Thinking of the spices as completely disjunct will make it much harder to make a stew, because you don't know how they enforce each other. So instead of the old idea that it was a plus combination, some sort of addition, so you just added the ingredients and the sum of the ingredients was the taste. No, it's nothing of the kind. It is the combination that makes the taste. And that actually solved a puzzle I had in my head for many years. Wow, these 30 years. Every time I pass through this chain that makes sandwiches, What's the name of that chain?
7-Eleven.
No, the other one.
No, yes.
I don't remember the name, but it's an American chain, and they make sandwiches. And even if I'm not aware it's around, I recognize the smell of their baked bread. And I've never had an explanation for that. How is that possible? How is it possible that their bread smells differently when it's baked? And now I realize the exact combination of the ingredients will send off to a very different direction in olfactory and sensory perception. And that is the synergetic effect.
Subway.
Huh?
Subway.
Thank you, Subway, Subway chain. And this is something I've been wondering for years without thinking about it actually. I never thought about it. I never posed the question until now. I think it actually was because I know that could not be an answer. But now I know there is an answer, and the answer is this synergetic effect. And that also is something I taken up earlier when I was speaking about the beton of the Roman civilization, and how we in modern times we have not been able to imitate it. The reason could be that everything needs to be in the exact proportions, and it has to be sort of blended in the right way, in the same direction, or so many details. And that can only be learned by being in the place. It cannot be learned by putting up a recipe. Sometimes a recipe works, but with some things it doesn't work. And it seemed to be the case with the Roman beton. It has never worked to this date. And that's very interesting, because if we had that beton, we would have been able to make billions of dollars, because that would change the whole building industry when it comes to bridges, especially in salt water. Because there we lose a lot of money each year caused by erosion. But that's the same effect when what happens with the senses. They amplify each other's. And they amplify each other's in the same way I previously explained how we sort of project our sensory organs to the exogenous sphere. That different sensory organs actually project to each other as well. So the actual effect can be incredibly hard to judge preemptively. You don't know what the effect is going to be. And that actually gives a very good point to how reality is constructed. Because in some ways, as Heidegger would say, either you have it or you don't have it. There is no like percentage of reality. Some people just miss out on everything. And that is caused by this specific, very precise effect that can on the surface look very sloppy and coarse, but is actually incredibly exact. And it just comes into the working phase once you actually use your senses at the very same time and direct it into the same direction. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Remember the serpent? I mentioned that one maybe a year ago. The serpent has all his organs situated in a certain direction, going forward, in the direction where the serpent is moving. And you can see that that is still the case with human beings. It's not so obvious in human beings, but that is actually the same thing. And that means that we need to put our sensory organs in the same direction as we are moving. And since human movement is extraordinarily complicated in contrast to a serpent, we need to understand how that movement works. It goes upwards and forward, and that's a whole other business. I won't go into that now. It's very interesting, but we know that that has an effect on how we understand the world. And I mentioned 4 lectures ago about tinnitus and how I used to be working for the Hearing Impaired Society here in Sweden called Hörselfrämjandet. And at that time I was in contact with a doctor who was very famous for the first treatment of a disease called tinnitus. He was, I think by some people he was considered to be out of the establishment, and some people even had suspicions about him not being the real McCoy, not being a good scientist. I thought it was very interesting, and he was talking about the connection between our hearing organ, and as you know, the hearing organ has 3 different functions. One is the cochlear, but there are 2 other functions, and that's the balancing function and the acceleration function, and they are conjoined, they are together. So what happens if you get tinnitus is that you fix your position of your head in a certain angle towards the neck, and he mechanically changed that and therefore alleviate the tinnitus. It sounds really weird, but that has actually become an acclaimed treatment for tinnitus. But even more interesting is the connection that is between localization and hearing, because if we have a defect in the hearing, and a defect in the hearing is actually when we think hearing is disjunct to vision, for instance, and that defect we all suffer from in the Western Hemisphere, that will mean that we try to hear separately, and we try to see separately, and we try to feel separately, and that disjunct, that will be both out of sequence and out of place, because we cannot localize without our hearing. Hearing is absolutely crucial for our localization ability. And I remember the balance organs. Please remember the balance organs and the acceleration organs. They are responsible for that you have a good balance. If your hearing is out of place, your balance will also be out of place, and vice versa. And that also means that you can help your balance and the hearing at the very same time. And you can do that from 2 different perspectives. One thing is that you can train directedness. And directedness you train by taking in something I call the hearing space. It is that you send out your hearing to surround you as a whole. For instance, those birds over that place, and what I have above me. Above me I feel a dampening of sound, because there's a tree above me, and the leaves will actually dampen the sound of my voice. By sending out that spatial hearing, I would actually help my balancing function. And this is exactly what's happening in this very instance when I'm talking about it. I feel that I get more balanced on the ground, and this is a very important feature in the grounding procedure. And I think that also helps with understanding, once we're trying to send our attention, never ever try to look up or look back or look on the side, because then you establish the division between the senses even more. You have to send your attention, your awareness out. And if you do that, you automatically get rewarded with a higher degree of balance. Once you get a higher degree of balance, that will also mean, interesting, according to Adamski and Sedlak, 2 researchers within the area, once you get more balanced, your understanding of a written text will also develop. So even if you don't hear any sound, even if you're sitting in a sound chamber where all the sound is getting sucked up, so not even talking to yourself would give you any feedback, there is still going on within the head a sending out and a receiving, and that will be better once you put yourself into balance. And the difference was actually staggering. You can further your reading ability by at least 20 to 25%, and that means that you can elevate your understanding of complex matters. And Adamski looked specifically into mathematics, and mathematics is especially cumbersome because it is very hard to sound out mathematical problems. Words are somewhat simpler because you can sound them out, but whereas an equation is tougher, but you can do it. It takes a little bit of specific training, and that means that you can access an area that might have been shut out of you before. And especially one thing that affects when it comes to these very fine-tuned understandings is the stress level. It has already been noticed, especially in this environment of a lot of sound, music going on, people using headphones and all that. That could actually make it harder to project, because you are so directed into listening, and then you lose your balance, because you, like, if I want to hear Kalle, come here, if I want to hear what Kalle says, I could actually put myself out of balance, and you can see people do that. What did you say? Look at my balance, it gets out of you. The same thing is actually happening when you read a difficult, for instance, a mathematical text that Adamski showed, but also other abstract text. You tend to lean somewhat, not this much, but the leanage you can't even be perceived by the human eye, but that leanage will put you out of balance, and it would actually make it harder to understand the text. So it is a whole alley of complications. I think that's enough for now. Yes?
Before, I would like only to show the title to the viewer. So this was, no, which one was it?
It was more this one, but
okay,
I was taking material.
let me show it quickly. Experiments suggest humans can directly observe the quantum. Okay, thank you. And then this other was synesthesia. Yes, so my question to you, Hans, so your lecture makes sense, to make a pun, and in the word, in this expression, English expression, it makes sense.
Yes.
There is no point of what in this word sense, it makes sense. What would it refer to? My question is, the serpents can feel earthquakes hundreds of kilometers away.
Yes.
I don't know if they do with the ears, but I suppose it's with the whole body. In the case of serpents.
Yes, it does it with the whole body, but the directedness of the serpent is very important.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not I think this happened quickly here in the lectures, and I need to tell that to the listeners as well. But something happened. We realized more and more that all the perception is active. And since the serpent is very directed, that helps actually incredibly much with the perception. As I said, especially from Adamski, from this paper, it shows that there are very, very few people who can observe those minute effects. It could be 1/10 of a promille or even less. But there is a huge connection between directedness and how much you can perceive. And the minute details, especially the very small, like being able to perceive an earthquake before it's happened and all those things. I didn't know about the serpent, but I earlier heard about tortoises being able to do that. It has a lot to do with the directedness. And since a serpent and a turtle are much more directed than modern human beings, and I need to point to that, it's modern human beings. We actually noted cases where people living in Sumatra can perceive earthquake, and they're human beings. They're just more directed. And the interesting thing, the difference between understanding a very complicated text, like a really abstract or a mathematical text, it is not that much difference from perceiving minute changes in your environment. It is the same thing. And that means, I see it on the positive side, that means that you can train things that you think are in the book and can't be touched by yourself, because how do you reach into your brain and fix your intellect? It sounds very hard. You can actually train that by directing your senses more outwards, and to understand that synesthesia is an actual thing in quantum mechanics, for instance. And since quantum mechanics is the real world, it does make sense to use those things to understand the world. So minute details that you learn to sort of direct towards in your daily life will also help you with a mathematical text. And I think it's been mentioned before that a lot of mathematicians are very good at both playing music and understanding music. And the connection between music and mathematics is very slim, but it has to do with perception and sending out perception, being active. And especially when understanding a mathematical text, you really need to send it out there. Because if you don't send it out there, your understanding won't come. It doesn't come from passivity. I think that's about enough today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.